Well, good morning. Time for another health-related podcast. Today, I let AI decide of all the different things we've discussed. I got hundreds of possible podcast ideas and interactions. And so today it gave me a series of ideas, and so I put two together. It recommended that I share my idea that inflammation is a broad, almost endemic issue with so many people today. And it also suggested trauma training. I argue that we need to teach everyone about trauma before they're traumatized. It's arguably too late after. Where that came up is I was working with the Veterans Affairs. I don't know what they call themselves now in Canada. And they have these therapists that help the soldiers, and I mentioned that, they should be trained in trauma because they're not. The therapists are not trained in trauma. But what I meant was that the soldiers and the families should be trained in trauma before they ever go to war, but that just fell on deaf ears, as so much does. So here's my podcast. The title is The Hidden Link Between Trauma and Inflammation, and why we should teach about both before it's too late. So imagine waking up every day feeling exhausted, in pain, or emotionally drained, without knowing why. Maybe it's brain fog, skin issues, digestive problems, or a constant sense of stress or ennui. What if I told you that the root cause might not be just stress or just a health issue, but a deeper, overlooked connection between trauma and inflammation? We train people in first aid for physical emergencies, CPR, choking, burns. But what if we're missing something even more common? What if we should be training people in inflammation and trauma first aid, teaching them how to regulate their immune system, manage stress responses, and prevent long-term damage before it happens? So the trauma-inflammation feedback loop. Most people think of trauma and inflammation as separate issues. One is psychological, the other physical, but the research increasingly shows they're two sides of the same coin. Chronic stress and trauma release cortisol, which over time dysregulates the immune system. Inflammation is the body's response to stress, whether from injury, food, or emotional trauma. When stress becomes chronic, the body stops distinguishing between physical and emotional threats, leading to autoimmune issues, fatigue, and chronic pain syndromes. This means that unresolved trauma doesn't just affect mental health, it affects the body, leading to conditions such as chronic inflammatory skin disease, autoimmune conditions often triggered by prolonged stress, digestive disorders such as gut inflammation from stress responses, brain fog and fatigue, neuroinflammation from cortisol imbalance, or just from stress or from anxiety or overthinking. And yet most medical and psychological treatments focus on one or the other, or simply the symptoms, instead of recognizing the entire system is connected. So why we need inflammation and trauma first aid? If we know trauma and inflammation fuel each other, why are we only addressing them after people get sick or burned out? We need to start teaching inflammation management and trauma resilience as basic life skills. This isn't about waiting until people are in therapy or on medications. It's about prevention. Imagine if, in schools and workplaces, people learned how to spot early signs of inflammation and stress overload, because they spiral into disease, chronic disease, and work outages, billions of dollars lost to simply these issues. What if in schools and workplaces people learned which foods and habits regulate inflammation naturally instead of relying on medication? How emotional trauma can manifest physically and what to do about it? And practical, daily techniques to reset the nervous and immune system. The example I might give is there's a pilot program. They had to do it in South America because they couldn't find anywhere in North America to do it. But they're teaching kids mindfulness, meditation, emotional regulation at a very, very early age, as young as grade 3, I believe. Don't quote me though. It might be grade 6 and grade 3, but I believe it's as young as 6 years old. They're teaching them some of these skills, but I digress. This is not just self-care. This is about preventing long-term suffering and arguably healing family. When we have so many examples of what they now call intergenerational or multi-generational trauma, well, how do we heal that? It's one generation at a time. Right? But so why this matters now, in conclusion, we are facing a silent crisis. Chronic inflammation and unresolved trauma are driving a hidden epidemic of illness, burnout, and emotional instability. But instead of waiting for people to break down, we could teach them how to regulate their bodies and minds before it's too late. This isn't a niche issue. It's something that affects everyone at some point in their life. Just like we teach physical first aid, it's time to start teaching trauma and inflammation first aid, because in the modern world, learning to manage both might be the most important survival skill of all. And I don't disagree. And I just want to put as a last little idea that trauma and inflammation most specifically are tied to the idea that trauma is not the way it's being defined and understood today. Trauma is simply something that happened to you in the past that you're really living today as if it were happening today. So for Nietzsche called it ressentiment, which is a French word that he used purposely because it's this idea of resentiment, right? Ressentiment, to re-feel again. And that does build up a certain amount of resentment, as is often explained, but is not what the problem is. The problem is we become resentful of the world because we're not engaging with it authentically anymore. So we become, well, nihilistic, apathetic, or worse. Imagine. But the issue is we're not engaging with the world authentically, so we're not getting an authentic vibe. Right? I talked about this before, that children learn better when it's a multimodal experience, right? When they're hearing and seeing and touching. Children learn better on tablets than they learn better writing by hand than they do on tablets alone. It's simply this full spectrum idea of healing. So I'm even simplifying it by just tying cortisol, inflammation, and trauma together. But it is a whole picture, right? The experiences we've been through make up who we are. But arguably, the theory of trauma here, going back to one of the first psychologists to talk about it, again, Nietzsche, the idea is not that it's debilitating. The idea is it's simply an experience that it was either overwhelming or unique, troublesome in some fashion, that it caused us to continue to react to the world based on that template. And this is Nietzsche's transvaluation of all values, and consider a trauma response a value, a trigger, if you will. And so our job is to, well, honestly, it's as simple as just, redefining the experiences, the traumas, right? It's, I laugh all the time that Jordan Peterson may be dead on when he talks about this narrative, right? He started teaching his kids, right? The opposite of Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman laughs at his students because they can't write essays. Doesn't teach them how to write, just continues to give them assignments for essays and laughs at them when they fail. But Jordan Peterson, which is nice of him, he noticed his students were having trouble with writing. So he designed a program that allowed them to write their story, narrate their story. But what he found is it kept them in school for longer, made them more engaged. And I argue this is the trauma insight that he really should have been going all in on. That the reason why we suffer so much as people is we haven't integrated our experience. Right? Peterson should understand this as a Nietzschean and a Jungian. Right? They both wrote about this idea. Jung said individuation is, finding out who you truly are by engaging authentically with your unconscious. And part of that is our trauma, our history, our experience. I mean, I've given this example before, and I tried to explain this to a family member once, and they just didn't understand it. How children tend to remember their past differently from what really happened. And that causes an incredible disconnect and trauma and suffering. And healing only requires you to go back and remember authentically what happened. Retell your story the way it was meant to be told. And so often parents don't want children to do that because they argue, well, you're blaming parents, but it's not blame if we're just looking at reality and focusing on healing, right? Because we're so often about this, right? This is procrastination, isn't it? We're so often more afraid of the short-term pain than we are on the long-term suffering, right? And so this is what we're looking at here, right? By changing your diet in little ways, you could change your everyday baseline of suffering, right? My life has changed exponentially, but you'll never understand how it's very perspectival. Because when I was at my worst, yes, I could barely get by because of the pain and the suffering. But arguably what I've noticed is it's very, well, perspectival. What I mean by that is I knew other people with similar conditions of mine, nowhere near as bad off as I was, but they complained about how bad their pain was. And I used to think they were just making it up. Or they were blowing it up, but what I've come to realize is it's dependent on your situation, right? I know for a fact that my pain is one tiny fraction of what it used to be, but at times it's still almost as debilitating, right? I worked through the fog of constant chronic pain and was able to still function. Now, I didn't function at a high level, but fast forward to today, the pain is nowhere near as bad, but I allow it to distract me almost as much. Right? So this is this focus, this awareness, this acceptance. And like I said, the idea that pain is 80% psychological. And that's this inflammation. I call it psychological systemic inflammation syndrome, PSIRS, systemic inflammatory response syndrome. There's something called SIRS, SIRS, systemic inflammatory response syndrome, and I call this psychological systemic inflammation response syndrome, PSIRS. Trauma. That's all it is. Right? If we're suffering, if we're anxious, if we're tortured by something in our past, it causes stress, it causes cortisol, it causes inflammation, and in turn it can cause chronic illness, disease, and even la mort. So, for that reason, this is why, I feel at times a success and at times a failure, because, I still have all my diseases, I still suffer, but I've come so far that medical science doesn't believe. And I used to tell my one buddy who almost healed his liver naturally. Something his doctors still don't believe that he did. He's in a new state now in America where they're a little more on his side about it, but when he was in his original state, they wouldn't believe that he was healing. And here I am the same. For years I was told, many of these diseases, conditions that I have are incurable. I can't remember. I think it's incurable. But the real idea here is, they used to say that about dyslexia. They say that about my autoinflammatory disease. They say that about my allergies. But here's the real trick. They don't have to be curable if you can eliminate almost all of the symptoms. Am I correct? Because I have one of the worst autoinflammatory diseases you can have, because it affects every aspect of your life. And arguably, I don't really care now whether it's curable, because I've realized that I can make it, except for Like I have to be careful with my lifestyle, my emotional regulation, but everyone should be doing that. I have to be careful what I eat. I don't think that's uncommon. I have allergies, but I think a lot of people probably have food sensitivity, right? I mean, they just don't notice. Like, for example, my wife, I know 100% that she would be better on a low carb diet because I've been experimenting the last 6 months just to prove my theories. And, low carb diet. She doesn't have the inflammatory response to the degree that I have unless she really overdoes it. But even a little too much carbs, a little too much junk food, a little too much preserved food, stuff from the middle aisles of the grocery store, a little too much of that. Her brain fog comes back, her mindfulness dies, she becomes more negative. I liken it to hydrating, right? For a long time, that was when I first started getting into this and, helping people as best I could. And when I helped people realize that most of us walk around dehydrated and we just don't even realize it. We don't realize it until we hydrate properly. Right? You start drinking a gallon a day for a week, a couple of weeks, you start feeling great, but then you normalize. And everything seems normal again. Until you stop hydrating. That's when people notice how horribly dehydrated they were at, their average resting state. Right? They notice the headaches, they notice the fatigue, they notice the cramps. But we don't notice that until we fix it. Right? Arguably, there's Schopenhauer's, we learn best from loss. And in this case, we learn best about our suffering if we subdue it. If we, you know what I'm saying? It's a weird situation. I mean, I was saying to my buddy yesterday, we live in a weird world today, but even weirder is ourselves. I left a message on social media. I was a Nietzsche quote about how, people could bother us. A Hemingway quote as well. People are the worst. And it relates to Jean-Paul Sartre. The existentialist Sartre. He had a quote. It said, L'enfer, c'est les autres. Which is, hell is others. And this is really what he meant. People don't usually understand that, same as Nietzsche. It's the idea that, Jung said it, we suffer others because it's ourselves we see in them that we're bothered by. But I make a greater joke that worse than the guests are ourselves. All right, I make this joke that Jesus would have to reteach his tenets, because today the hardest thing for us to do, we can love God with all of our strength, love the universe, however you want to define that. But the hardest thing for us is not to love our neighbor. No, that's actually quite a bit easier. Hardest thing for us to do is to love ourselves. So, arguably, are we truly loving our neighbor? But I digress. Because I disagree with Augustine as well. Because the famous Christian, what would you call him? Theologian, philosopher. He argued it was natural and easy for us to love ourselves. Well, I think that's wrong. I think one of the hardest things for us to do is to love and accept ourselves. I think that's a big part of ressentiment and inflammation and stress. Cortisol is not just the stress of everyday life. It's the stress of our own milieu, our own situation, our own place. I talked about this in a previous podcast. I call it the problem of prophilicity. We're all running around inventing a persona, a personality, a profile. I call it a configuration file of the self. We're just running around pretending to be something we're not. But the real problem here is, as Martin Buber said, the only way to achieve individuation, actualization, as Jung would call it, is by interacting authentically with yourself and with others, right? This is Martin Buber's I and Thou. And there's the rub. If none of us are being authentic, then it is wholly impossible for us to individuate, and arguably, we're lost. Nietzsche in his later workbook said he warned us of this. He said we may have lost our nature. and we would have to back translate ourselves to find it. And I think that's what we're engaged with right now. We're trying to back translate ourselves. I call it a meta-modernist movement, not like what the kids call nowadays, but a true meta-modernism. Nietzsche's reevaluation of all things. McLuhan's warning that we shouldn't replace all old stuff with new tech for just assuming that it'll be better. We need to reevaluate everything, right? So that's where we are. As I said, it really does boil down to Jung's famous quote. He said all of his patients that were suffering from this unattributable malaise, this ennui that we all suffer, I call it the modern malaise, right? We're lost because we're disenfranchised from ourselves, from each other, from society, from meaning. Well, it's a simple solution. It's what's helped me, it's what's solved me, and it's really what's kept me aligned since arguably I was about 14 years old in a mall food court. And I did the thought experiment about are we the center of the universe and everyone else is just there for my entertainment? Right? And I just couldn't justify that, when I leave the cafeteria, everyone else is just disappears, or they go on with their life only waiting to be in my movie. They don't have any real engagement. I thought that was absolutely ridiculous. It really is what McGilchrist would call a flattening of everything. We like to simplify things, and I think that's what we do. We try to oversimplify how complicated the world is. I can't remember who said it, but they said, usually it's only children that don't know what other people don't know. And this is maybe the inverse. We don't know. Oh, maybe it is. We don't know how much we don't know. Right? In this case, we don't stop and realize the richness of the experience in everyone else. How much they're struggling as much as we. Right? But for me, it was Jung's quote. He said, to solve this problem, every single one of his patients were healed by adopting a religious view in life. And I've confirmed with the German, he doesn't mean go out and adopt a religion. People often misunderstand, because Jung explored Eastern philosophy and religion and the Chinese Book of Change and alchemy and mysticism. But he did come home to his childhood religion and the archetypes, but he explained it very clearly. He didn't feel it necessary for any other reason except he just felt more comfortable, right? Those were the archetypes he was raised with. And science kind of agrees with him. There was a book written about 20, 30 years ago, I can't remember now, about the idea of faith and how we gain our faith and how we hold and keep our faith. And the author talked about some of the hardest faith to shake are the faith that we are instilled with when we're young, right? The age when we don't know not to touch a hot surface. We have to be told. And arguably, I think this is what Jung's getting at. Like the archetypes with the most gravitas to us would be the ones from our earliest childhood. But he didn't come back to religion in the sense. He was still a practicing, I don't know what, alchemist. What he meant is to engage with the world in a religious way. And it shocks me. So many people misunderstand what that word means. Religion is simply the path you follow with devotion and commitment. And in so doing, you achieve some confidence. Not certainty, but some confidence. And that's what Jung said would solve our issues. And I agree with him. If we began engaging with the world authentically and we revered things, if we saw the world as divinely given, right? As a buddy of mine who is an atheist said, there's so much in this world to see as unique. I mean, just the earth spinning around in space alone. I mean, if it were out of kilter by even a tiny fraction, we would be frozen or be cooked. So you can see the uniqueness, the specialness, the wonder, the awe, as Keltner would call it, or enchantment, as Storms would say, right, from his book The Myth of Disenchantment, and Dashner Keltner wrote the book Awe. It's the same idea, and I liken it, and here's where my interdisciplinary stuff comes in. We're tapping the same place, right? If you look at deep states of meditation, psychosis, and psychedelic experience, they all are treated the same by medicine because I think they're all the same in the brain. But here's the difference. It's very much like the polymodal coding I told you, that if you only look at something, you're not going to learn as much as if you were to look and read or look and listen. And this is the same as psychedelics, same as, Vision Quest. Because psychedelics ends up being colored lights that hypnotize. It's not the full spectrum. Whereas, true insight, say a Vision Quest or deep states of meditation, that's something that we actually have to work at and develop at, which end up being a polymodal, I should say, a polymodal way, because we often use the physicality, the somatic, as well as the psychological in that practice. Whereas often other ways to activate this awe perception, wonder perception, the serotonin receptor. I personally think the reason why psychedelics are short-lived is because, it's the same as memories. They say the memories that last are the ones that you have to work for. It's as simple as that. I do believe this is maybe why ibogaine works, is because it is so challenging. But again, you can't quote me on that. But that's just a theory. So I argue that's what we're meant to do here. I can't believe I realized that too, but me and a buddy were just talking about this, how difficult it can be. Like I gained 20, 30 pounds when I got on this new medication, and I blamed it on the antihistamine. But what it really was psychology, because I went years denying myself everything. Right? I was eating so restrictively that my brain just went off the deep end. Because even bodybuilders have cheat days, and they explained it's psychological, right? Because if you eat restrictively all the time, it can really mess with your brain. And then my buddy mentioned that we do this now with keto or low carb. They call it carb loading, right? So if you find yourself plateauing, go ahead and eat some carbs for a day, or I think that's what he said, and then go back on to the low carb. It's amazing how adaptive, how plastic the human mind and body is. And so arguably we've adapted to, just the wrong situation. The wrong situation, right? So here we are. Right, what is sanity now? It's an old quote. Is an insane reaction natural in an insane situation? Is it even possible to be sane? Is that old quote about, right? But I just, my touchstone is the idea that insane people don't question their sanity. It's the sane people that do. So as long as we're questioning the status quo, remember that's the way things are, not the way they could be or should be. As long as we're still questioning the status quo, as long as we're not the people that are trying to defend the way things are, usually out of fear for the way things could be, well, I think we're pointed in the right direction. I argue, as Nietzsche said, we're not meant to be comfortable when we're carving a new path. We're meant to be uncomfortable. We're meant to be in the unknown, because your true self will be unknown to you. I've always said this, that we're meant to try to embody our idols, try to embody our betters. And when we fail, we should land at our true self. And that's individuation. So, on that note, thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.